Um, the title for class or the presentation this morning is an action guide for relocalization, practical steps we can all take today. And the reason I wanted to talk a little bit more about the practical implementation of this idea of relocalization is because over the past maybe 2 or 3 months, the classes that I've shared, some of the feedback that I've received is that this is all, really good critique. We've looked at a lot of economic issues, ecological and environmental issues, issues around education, etc. And a lot of it's critique about how the development industry and development projects are not aptly responding to some of the challenges that we face. And at the end of every class, I try to offer a few suggestions or ideas about how we can really root development projects in localities, in regions, to try and empower people, empower communities. And I wanted to take kind of a more in-depth look at that. So the class this morning, the summary of the class is I want to take a quick look, kind of trying to tie together the idea of relocalization to the world of community development. Relocalization is a word that's kind of gained a little bit of popularity in the past month or past years. There's institutions and organizations that are completely devoted to this idea of relocalizing economic life, relocalizing agricultural production, relocalizing our energy systems, relocalizing education, relocalizing cultural pursuits. And the idea is that this concept of relocalizing is kind of the antithesis of everything that has been occurring, the kind of direction of this globalized world in which we live, especially going back, maybe starting with the Industrial Revolution, but really taking off in the past 100 years or so, especially after World War II ended. There has been this globalization of everything, right? So globalization of technology, globalization of educational parameters, educational systems, globalization of our agricultural production, obviously of the economic systems in which we live. And today, it's very rare for any of us, unless we live kind of as an uncontacted tribes person in Indonesia or in the Amazon or in some part of Africa. Most people today, things that we purchase, things that we use, are the products of this globalized economic system in which we live today. And this move towards localization is a recognition that there is an enormous amount of vulnerability, increasing vulnerabilities associated with the globalized nature of the world in which we live. Um, and these localization initiatives are not necessarily saying that we need to completely get rid of any sort of globalized communication networks, such as the ones we're using today on Zoom as we share this class, or certain forms of trade or anything like that. But it is saying that we do need to revalue what is local. We do need to repotentiate, create a major or greater resiliency within localized systems. And so today I want to take a look at that, looking at the importance of relocalization, and then offer some suggestions and some ideas and some case studies about how we can relocalize our agricultural production, the food that we eat, our waste management systems, the energy that we use to power our homes, for the electricity, for the energy, for the heat, etc. How to relocalize education and culture as well. So different ideas and kind of looking at how people are doing this around the world, and then some of the challenges that come with relocalization. As always, I'm going to try and leave at least 15 minutes at the end of this class for questions, experiences, critiques. I always learn together with our students, and so I would ask Dr. Cambiro at the end of my presentation to
Someone is, please unmute your microphone. Uh, Mute your microphone. Now you can start. It's clear. Continue, please.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. You heard my introduction, right? I wasn't muted the entire time. No.
Yes, yes, I'm hearing.
Okay.
Go
Okay.
ahead, please.
All right. So let's start with the issue of the importance of relocalization.
Sorry.
Okay, is that
You
better?
can unmute your. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
Unmute. Mm.
Okay. So let's start with the importance of relocalization for the world of development. If you look at this graph on the left, this is a graph taken from a leading global economic website. And it's the growth of global exports. In terms of global economy, what percentage of economic activity is related to the export market, right? And so if you look at this graph, what's kind of fascinating is, starting in 1800 up until around 2015, around 1800, there was absolutely zero global export, or accounted for almost nothing in terms of global GDP, right? There was obviously some, with the beginning of the exploration age, when people from Europe started exploring Asia and Africa, and then the New World of the Americas, and there was the export of sugar and certain things, but it always was a very, very small percentage of global economic output, almost negligible. There was a few things, obviously, people. When we think of, for example, Italian food, we think of tomatoes, and tomatoes are not obviously not native to that part of the world. So there was, certain trade with certain foodstuffs that only grew in the Americas, back to the old world, etc. But it was mostly, very small. There was the spice trade with Asia, but it was negligible at the most. But starting in the post-World War II areas in 1950, you see an enormous increase in globalized trade. And this is something that not only impacted the so-called developed world of North America and Europe, but it was kind of the forced opening up of economic borders of every part of the world. Colonialism was obviously very, a part of this of industrial powerful nations coming into the developed world and forcing them to open up their economies, to reduce tariffs, and to accept production from the rest of the world. And so what we have today is like I mentioned, almost everything that we use, everything that we touch, everything that we purchase is connected to this global supply chain, right? So there's lots of interesting examples of apples that are grown in South America will be exported to some Asian country where they're turned into applesauce or baby food. And then that food is again transported back across the ocean to Africa, to North America, to Europe. So everything that we touch has traveled an enormous distance. Here's just a few statistics that I think are interesting. One, it is estimated that meals in the United States travel about 1,500 miles to get from the farm to the plate. Um, and that's everything from fresh vegetables and fruits to processed foods, especially if you look at the amount of processed foods, things that come in boxes and cans that people purchase at the supermarket. Those processed foods with their long ingredient list, that 1,500 miles is probably very limited. So a lot of the food additives were made in one part of the world and sent to another part of the world where they're manufactured, then they're transported again to the final destination. So everything, even things that we eat, there's an enormous supply chain that incorporates that's incorporated into the global economic system. At the same time, something that is very interesting is that the average price for a 40-foot cargo ship container, so those huge containers that are stacked on top of these the cargo ships that run the shipping industry, the cost in April of 2022, so after the pandemic, was about $9,300 to ship one 40-foot container, right? It could contain food, it could contain electronics, whatever is being transported. That price was double the cost the same ship a year ago. In 2019, pre-pandemic, the cost of shipping one 40-foot container was about $4,500. Today in 2022 is about 9,300. Today is up to about 12,000. So the cost of this global supply chain network is increasing, and that shouldn't come as a surprise. I mean, everybody in every part of the world looks at inflation these days. The cost of essential food, of essential items, everything is increasing, and the cost of maintaining this global supply chain is becoming increasingly more difficult to sustain. And we're going to take a deeper look at that here just a second.
Yeah,
Another thing that, yes?
continue.
Another kind of aspect of the vulnerability associated with this global economic model is associated with the trucking industry. It's amazing when you think about how many things that we buy, that we purchase, that we use that are absolutely dependent on trucks, on these large semi trucks that transfer things from one port to the interior, from one port to the other, from one country to another. There was recently a study done about what would happen if the global trucking industry came to a halt, right? It could be that truckers and transportation managers went on strike. It could be that there was a lack of fuel, whatever it might be. But if it did come to a halt within 20, I'm going to read. This is kind of the conclusion of the study that was done, that was published in a major academic journal about a year and a half ago, and it said if the global trucking industry came to a halt. Within 24 hours, medical supplies, hospitals, and nursing homes will begin to run short. Gas stations will begin to run low on gas as they require sometimes 2 trucks a day to refill. Manufacturers will begin to run short on components needed to run their assembly lines. Mail delivery will cease. Within 48 hours, food supply in stores will begin to dwindle. Gas stations will become increasingly low on fuel, which will skyrocket prices as left on their supply. After 72 hours or 3 days, grocery stores will start running out of essentials like bread and milk and water and canned meat due to consumer panic and hoarding. ATMs, banks will run out of cash and will not be able to complete transactions. Gas stations will completely run out of fuel within 3 days. Garbage will begin to pile up in the streets with no trucks to pick it up. Container ships will sit idle in ocean ports. Within 1 week, all automobile and plane travel will cease, as will public transportation. People will not be able to go to work, to grocery stores, or to seek medical care. Hospitals begin to deplete their oxygen supplies, and within 2 weeks, clean water will begin to run dry. Within 4 weeks, clean water supply will be gone, leaving contaminated water to use only if boiled. This will increase intestinal illness in an already weakened healthcare system. Within 1 month, the country would be totally disabled in a complete chaotic state. This is an example of showing how reliant we are on long distance transportation. And this is just related to the trucking industry. We're not talking here about global shipping, which is another major aspect of the global supply chains that we use. This picture here. I don't know if you all remember back in, I think it was 2021. This is the Suez Canal. So it's a man-made canal connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea between Africa and the Middle East. And there was a huge container ship that had loaded up a bunch of materials in some port in Europe, and they were traveling through the Suez Canal. There were strong winds, and it blew the ship kind of crossways, and it got stuck. Right, so it got stuck in the Suez Canal. And these are obviously massive ships; they're not easy, and so there was this crisis. Nobody knew what to do. And so they brought in these machines. They tried to get it unstuck, and I forget how long exactly, but it essentially blocked the canal for about 2 or 3 weeks. What that mean, every day in these canals, hundreds of ships pass through. And so what happened was just, one freak accident of, a little bit of wind blowing a ship off of course and blocking a canal caused major disruptions in supply chain management across the world. There was food shortages in certain parts of Africa because of this one example. A lot of ships were carrying components from Asia to Europe. All of the different things that are manufactured and produced in China couldn't get through this canal. They had to do the long route all the way around the Horn of Africa to go through the other side of the Mediterranean Sea. And this one example, completely shook up global supply chain and our global economic model. Today, we say the same thing with the COVID-19 pandemic, the Russia-Ukraine war, and something as simple as we mentioned as a cargo ship being blown off course. All of these things are drastically impacting global supply chain management and interrupting, consumer patterns. Like I said, the vast majority of people today absolutely depend on this globalized economic world. In a world defined by destabilized climate, rising geopolitical tensions, more wars, etc., potential energy scarcities. What happens if the production of oil and gas and all of these things start to reduce, obviously our global shipping and trucking network is absolutely dependent on fuel. So all of this continued dependence on global supply chains is dangerous. It increases the vulnerability to all of these interruptions. And if something as simple as a little bit of wind can interrupt global supply chains, it should have people start to think about why we are implementing a global economic system that is so vulnerable, right? Because of these vulnerabilities, because of these issues related to global supply chain management and things, there are a lot of organizations and people who work in the development industry, local governments that are revaluing the idea of relocalizing production, right? Of trying to stimulate stronger local economies, right? It's important to mention that every human need can be provisioned within a certain locality, right? I think that's something that's very important to mention. If we go back to this first graph that I showed, before 1800, virtually everything that people used, so just a few generations ago, our great grandparents' generation or a little bit later, everything that people used was produced within what's known as a bioregion, right? So not necessarily, on a small family farm or in one small village or in one small community, but in an area where localized transport, can be managed, right? Where you're not dependent on things that come from one side of the globe to the other, right? So just a few generations ago, everything that we needed to survive was produced more or less locally or bioregionally. Bioregionalism is a word that I think is important to rediscover. It's a philosophy, an economic kind of philosophy that suggests that political, cultural, and economic systems are more sustainable and just, fair, if they are organized around naturally defined areas called bioregions. Another word to think of bioregions is ecoregions. So bioregions or ecoregions are defined through their physical and environmental features. So, for example, a watershed, soil and terrain characteristics, different cultural aspects as well, not just about the natural world, but about different cultural boundaries, where certain language groups operate, etc. Bioregionalism stresses that the determination of a bioregion is also a cultural phenomenon. It emphasizes local populations, local knowledge, and local solutions. This map right here is of the Pacific Northwest area of North America. And as you see, this is divided into different states in the United States, different provinces in Canada. There's actually an international border here, but there's actually a strong movement, both in Canada and the United States, to redefine this area, not as British Columbia, Washington State, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, Alaska, the Yukon Territory, but as a region known as Cascadia. And Cascadia it's this bioregion where there's a shared climate, where there's a shared kind of culture, and there's a lot of movement about trying to relocalize the economics of that region across these boundaries, across these international boundaries, across these state boundaries, and saying that this is kind of the natural bioregion that we should be operating within. A resilient bioregional economy and a resilient bioregional culture can act as a buffer against all of the increasing vulnerabilities of globalization that we talked about before, right? So if this area was able to come together to produce their food, their energy, et cetera, and all these different things, obviously they're going to be less impacted, by interruptions to the global supply chains that we mentioned above. Let's start to take a look at some strategies about how we can relocalize certain aspects of our lives, of our economies. Let's start with one of the most important things, food, right? Everybody eats. Most of us try and eat 3 times a day. And as I mentioned, the vast majority of foodstuffs that we eat today are completely dependent on this globalized agricultural model, where large monocultures are grown in one part of the area, they're shipped across the world to manufacturing facilities where they're processing the foodstuffs. The foods are then shipped back across the world to supermarkets. And so, yeah, the idea that foods travel, 1,500 miles or 2,300 kilometers from where they're produced to where they're eventually consumed. that doesn't have to be the case. Like I mentioned, most bioregions, most localities have the ability to feed their populations with the resources that we have. Many people wrongly assume that eating a local diet would mean reducing the diversity of what one eats. The exact opposite is true. Look at this graph here. Just four of the roughly 30,000 edible plant species in the world provide 60% of the world's dietary energy intake. So we can grow, some people say 30,000. I've also seen figures state up to 80,000, but let's say there's 50,000 edible food plants, right? And only four of those, rice, wheat, corn, and potatoes or maize, make up 60% of what we eat, of the energy that goes into our bodies, right? One example, in the country where I live, El Salvador, if you go to the main market, kind of the wholesale market in downtown San Salvador, you'll see roughly between 20 and 30 main food items, different fruits, vegetables, grains. But it's not very diverse, right? You'll see potatoes and carrots and certain fruits and vegetables, and obviously corn and beans, which is kind of the essence of our traditional diet. But really, there's only about 30 different food items, right? And the most of that is imported, from the global economy. El Salvador has an agricultural system that is waning. We import a lot of our foodstuffs from, a lot of the corn that we import comes from the United States with all of these free trade agreements, a lot of the fruits and vegetables from other Central American countries. However, if you go back a few generations and you ask, grandparents about what they would traditionally eat, the traditional Salvadoran diet consisted of hundreds of diverse fruits and nuts and grains, and especially perennial tree crops that have been ignored by the globalized food system, right? So here, my wife's grandmother would talk about the ohuste tree, would talk about the breadfruit, the bread nut, all of these diverse tropical fruits and fibers that used to be a part of the diet because people still grew those, right? They would go into the forests and they could harvest all of these different foodstuffs. And today, most people have no idea what those are. They're being lost. They're being extinguished. And one of the reasons is because a lot of these foods and nuts and fruits, aren't great for transporting long distances. One of the things that is always kind of really unfortunate about the globalized economic system is if you go to the United States, there's only one type of banana that's sold. It's the Cavendish banana. It's the banana that is very resilient. You can pick it green and it will last for a long time. It can be transported by ships from all of these Central American countries to North America. Um, but it's the worst tasting banana. It's one of the most nutritionally empty bananas. If you come to Central America, there are probably 60 to 70 different varieties, breeds, species of bananas. There are red bananas, there are big ones, there are small ones, there are some that are sweet, some that are lightly bitter, and all of them, are part of this diverse food ecosystem that we could have if we were to value less how well foodstuffs stand up to long distance transportation. If we were to value foodstuffs on their nutrition, on how easily they could be grown, how diverse they can be grown in an ecosystem, that opens up an enormous possibility for diversifying diets and also eating healthier, right? This here is a picture of the ohuste tree, which is used to be extremely abundant. You used to find ohuste trees, on every corner of the street. And it's one of the most uh, hugely producing nut trees. These nuts are extremely healthy, but today they're almost gone, right? And so, people used to make here in El Salvador, tortillas are kind of the one thing that everybody eats, and most people make tortillas out of corn. But you go back just two generations, everybody used to make tortillas out of ojuste as well. And this is an example of all of this diversity that's being lost by this kind of monoculture of globalized agricultural production. So relocalizing agriculture can also put pressure on farmers to implement healthier and more sustainable growing practices that contribute to the regeneration of the bioregion, right? If we I'm a small farmer. If I'm using, dangerous and unhealthy practices where I'm, using very strong chemicals, and the people who purchase my food start to get sick, well, they're going to have a way to boycott my foodstuffs. They're going to say, we don't want you to produce this way. We're not going to purchase your stuff. It's a way to exercise a certain level of control, a certain level of persuasion over what types of agricultural practices are used. Today, people use all sorts of dangerous pesticides and agrochemicals, and really there's not anything most people can do because we don't know our local farmers. We have no idea who's producing our food under what conditions. And this generally opens up to an enormous amount of abuses, both to the landscape and to the human body, through these dangerous and unhealthy agricultural practices. Localizing agriculture also learns how to take advantage of the different ecosystems and opportunities available for growing diverse food items, right? Here in Central America, where I live, almost the entire coast, which is the best farmland, it's, these lowlands, flat areas, are almost all grown for sugarcane, right? It is because the United States and Canada and other European nations want sugar because sugarcane doesn't grow very well in cold climates. So we've pretty much extinguished all of these diverse food systems, all of these perennial tree crops, all of these diverse tropical fruits and nuts and perennial grains that we could be growing just to grow one product that is exported to the United States, to Canada, and which is really pretty much nutritionally horrible, right? It's causing diabetes, it's causing obesity. This is an example of how industrialized, globalized food production is ruining, traditional foodscapes. And lastly, by growing diverse food items in localities, price fluctuations and inflation can be reduced to ensure food security for people. I recently read an article about in the Middle East, grain, wheat is one of the main staples of food, but obviously most countries like Egypt and Iraq and Iran and all these places grow very little wheat. They depend on wheat from mostly from Ukraine, which is kind of one of the bread baskets of the world. When the Russia-Ukraine war started, the price of grain skyrocketed, and so lots of people in Northeast Africa and certain parts of the Middle East could no longer purchase bread, right? So their diets were upended, right? By returning to localized food production, we're going to be less vulnerable to these price fluctuations because of geopolitical tensions, due to the rising price of fertilizers, due to all of these different issues. So that's one example, some of the benefits that come with relocalizing agricultural production. Oh, hold on just a second. Get this back.
Any help, any issue?
So the other thing that another aspect of relocalization is related to waste management, and a lot of us don't think about the globalizing of waste management. What most people don't know is that let's say in the United States, in Europe, when people separate their trash, supposedly they're being good stewards. They're trying to recycle their waste. For decades, almost all plastic waste, plastic trash, was shipped across the world to China and to other Southeast Asian nations where they had these huge recycling kind of businesses. So it's amazing to think that the trash streams that were generated by the developed world were not recycled locally. They were again dependent on this fossil fuel, energy intensive global transport network to move their waste from one part of the world to the other part of the world, where it was then some of it was recycled, a lot of it ended up in landfills, and then recycled back. The same thing is occurring today with what's known as e-waste or electronic waste. So every time a computer dies or a cell phone dies, most of these e-waste recycling centers are still located in China and other Asian countries. So your old cell phone that you supposedly are recycling is being sent across the world, where some of it is recycled, and a lot of it ends up as toxic waste in the backyards of small peasants, of farmers in these Asian nations. Our current waste management model in this globalized economic system operates on the principle of out of sight, out of mind. As long as the garbage truck comes and takes it away from my house, from my farm, from my community, we tend not to care about what happens. Within a bioregional or a localized kind of economic model, waste is not seen as something we want to get rid of, right? It's not something that we want to just get out of our locality, out of our home, out of our community. Waste is simply seen as an unused output. If the output is unusable or dangerous, well, we probably shouldn't be producing it in the first place. So, for example, plutonium, which is obviously a radioactive chemical that comes from the production of nuclear energy. There's really no good way to get rid of plutonium. What we do, a lot of times they bury it in the United States. It's sent to these underground storage facilities that are located very near indigenous reserves, so where traditional native populations live. And obviously, radioactive chemicals will last tens, if not hundreds of thousands of years. So thinking that we're going to be able to manage these extremely dangerous waste sources is probably not a good idea. Permaculture. A couple months ago, we did a class on permaculture principles. Aims to connect inputs and outputs so that different elements meet each other's needs, right? One of the ideas is that comes from permaculture is that in the natural world, there is no waste, right? Nothing is wasted. Everything is recycled. One person's waste is another person's treasure. In a forest ecosystem, when something falls to the ground, it's reutilized by another life form, another source, which adds to the fertility, which adds to the long-term regenerative capability of the system. We should be designing ecosystems and economic systems and life ways that mimic this pathway. This is an example of a neighbor of mine who recently planted a fig orchard. And here in Central America, we have 6 months of rain, 6 months of dry season. So he was thinking about how he could store water to water his fig trees. And he found a neighbor who was getting rid of a bathtub. So he took that bathtub and he fills it up with water that comes from his chicken coop. So it's a nutrient-rich water. It's kind of this very simple storage facility, and then he has a system where he drip irrigates all of his fig trees. So instead of throwing away this perfectly usable water storage tank, which was used as a bathtub, he's repurposed it into another use. In a localized or bioregional world, every output, so every supposed waste, everything that leaves the economic system would fit into some other part of the system. This would involve selecting against those inputs, consumer items, manufacturing process that create waste items that cannot be utilized somewhere else in the system. A localized waste management system would not only drastically reduce pollution and streams of contamination, but it could also act as a new input source for innovation, right? If our waste, if we operate within a localized system, then every waste product has to fit somewhere, right? If we just throw it into a landfill, that's going to contaminate our water sources, and we're going to suffer because of that, right? So I recently did a consulting project with an organization operating in the United Kingdom and the UK. And they have a fairly large production of potatoes in the UK. It's one of the things that they produce agriculturally. And they have these huge farms where they turn potatoes into potato chips, right? And so they have these machines that peel all of the potatoes. And for a long time, they were left with this enormous amount of potato peels that eventually was, thrown away, that was wasted, that was sent
Oh,
to the
no,
landfill.
Professor
That was
Tobias,
Yes,
how much minutes remaining for you? Just manage your time.
yeah. Thank you. I'll keep an eye on that. I'll try and end by 9:50. Okay, so there's this place in um where they take, and so there was a company that came and started to turn those potato peels into fiberboard. So fiberboard is like kind of like drywall, something that you can use for home construction. And that's an example of how when we operate within a closed system, right? When we operate within a local bioregional economy, we have to come up with ways to use the waste that we have. And that's just one example of kind of an innovative way to try and find a new purpose for an output, for a waste product, right? Another aspect of relocalizing should focus on energy systems. Here's a few statistics about how our globalized economic or energy system works today. Around the world, the generating stations, where electricity is produced, is an average of 200 miles away from where the home or building where it's consumed. So we have these huge substations where electricity is generated and then it's transported long distances. There's a lot of interesting statistics about how much energy is wasted, as it's sent across these power lines. The long distance transportation of energy of electricity is enormously wasteful. A lot of that is simply, electricity that's wasted through the wires. Obviously, to produce electricity and energy today, our world continues to be extremely dependent on fossil fuels, oil, coal, and gas, right? As of December 2020, the world had over 730,000 miles. That's over 1 million kilometers of operational oil and gas pipelines. That's enough to circle the earth over 30 times. So obviously we're mining gas, we're mining oil, and we're transporting it extremely long distances in order to fuel our economies today. At the same time, on average, every square meter of the Earth's surface receives about 164 watts per square meter of solar energy. Under clear sky conditions, right? Obviously, it's different. There's going to be differences in areas that are at extreme northern latitudes, areas where there's lots of fog and cloud cover. But in general, every part of the world is receiving at all times an enormous influx of energy. We can talk about solar energy. We can talk about wind energy. Here in Central America, where I live, there's lots of volcanoes. So underneath the soil, there's geothermal energy. Instead of depending on these this fossil fuel energy system where things have to be transported long distances, where it's an extremely energy intensive process to mine. Jeremy Rifkin is an author who wrote a book called The Third Industrial Revolution. And he talks about what's known as the energy internet, right? So if you look at this graph, this is a graph of centralized electricity generation, where you have a power plant, goes to the transmission lines, a distribution network, and the end users. This idea of distributed generation through the energy network is a network that efficiently supplies electricity to anyone and everywhere. The idea is that within a localized community, within a bioregion, everybody is producing electricity. Everybody has solar panels, has wind turbines, has geothermal, has small scale hydroelectric generators. And all of this goes to a localized control center. So a small town, a city, a bioregion, and that is then redistributed to different parts of the bioregion. This is something that's possible with the technology ideas that we have today. And it's a way to drastically reduce. Obviously, if you're depending on the mining of gas and oil for our electricity and energy needs, it's being transported long distances. There's obviously lots of issues related to greenhouse gas emissions. Obviously, also a localized energy grid might mean periodic intermittency, right? There might be times when it's extremely cloudy or extremely cold, and the energy production dips, right? But periodic intermittency would protect people against major regional outages. I don't know if you all followed the news, but in Cuba, Cuba has a very, very centralized generation system, electricity and energy generation system, and it's getting older. It's harder for Cuba to source oil and gas to run its power stations, and as a result, over the past weeks and months, in pretty much the entire country has been left, for days on end without electricity. If we had a localized energy grid, these large scale outages would be less common and much more manageable. Two other aspects of localization that I don't think get enough attention is the idea of relocalizing education. A couple months ago, I shared a class about the work of Ivan Illich, who is a philosopher who wrote a lot about education. And here's two quotes from his book, which is called Deschooling Society. He says, "School today is the advertising agency which makes you believe that you need the society as it is. And the society as it is today is a globalized economic model, right? So schools are aimed at forming young people to fit into this globalized economic reality. It's about taking people away from their communities, from their bioregions, from their localities to try and fit in to whatever the globalized economic model needs. You know, a young person from my community who studies at school, who becomes a professional, whether it be a nurse or a business person or a doctor or a lawyer, are probably thinking that they have to leave this rural area in order to function, right? In order to find economic opportunities. Illich also says that school today prepares people for the alienating institutionalization of life by teaching the necessity of being taught. Once this lesson is learned, people lose their incentive to develop independently. They no longer find it attractive to relate to each other, and the surprises that life offers when it is not predetermined by institutional definition are closed, right? So Illich was saying that, look, people always have the ability to self-provision. Localities, bioregions have the ability to self-provision, to provide their own food, their own water, their own lumber, their own housing, their own educational systems, their own energy. But we lose that ability because schools teach us that we have to depend on professionals and institutions. Essentially, that we have to outsource the needs of our lives to the global economic model in which we live. Instead of educating young people, instead of an educational system that expels young people from the rural communities in search of opportunities to use their education, we should be investing in localized educational institutions that focus on teaching young people skills to thrive within the region while also stimulating innovation to improve the places from where they're come. This is about completely redefining, I think, how education is conceptualized. And lastly, culture. I think it's fairly easy to say that we live in a globalized culture today. You can go to pretty much any part of the world, whether it be, Africa or Asia or South America, North America, and most young people are listening to the same types of music. They're watching the same movies. They're dressing the same. So there's this monoculture of people consuming the same stuff. Vandana Shiva, who is an academic from India, calls this monocultures of the mind, and she's written a really fascinating book that looks at this monoculture of globalized culture. There are no clear estimates of the number of artisans in the world. So if we look at like traditional artisanal production, which is one of the aspects of culture, although some craft groups believe it is the largest employer outside agriculture. With each endangered craft are centuries of songs, expressions, and lifestyles that are part of an artisan's creative environment. This is a quote from Nawal Hassan, who is an Egyptian artisan and activist. He says, "This is an issue of identity, right? All our civilization has ceased to be spiritual. Our civilization has become commercial." Right. So this idea that we're losing our traditional way of creating cultural expression that's tied to our places, to the natural world, to the environment, and we're increasingly consuming cultural content that is sold, right? Movies, music, clothing, fashion, all of these things are not connected anymore to the regional kind of aspects of our lives. Just one aspect of that I think is very, very dangerous and worrisome is the idea that by the end of this century, about half of the world's 6,000 languages will become extinct, right? I mean, language is obviously one of the most important cultural aspects. It's what forms our epistemological understanding, and we're losing half of that. Um, However, if we assume the idea of relocalizing agriculture, energy production, industry, waste management, education, well, all of that by creating a localized economic and life way, that gives that gives permission, I guess you could say, for autonomous cultural expressions to re-arise, right? Relocalizing cultural expression should be about both revaluing tradition and also constructing new cultural forms that belong to the localized place, right? Culture is this is a group of young men from an area in Guatemala where I used to live. They were interested in music. And one of the things that they saw very unfortunate was that the complete traditional music. There was no longer any Guatemalan people making music. And so they went and they studied all of the traditional instruments that used to be used and made by the Mayan people. And they reconstructed these instruments and they used these traditional instruments to make new forms of music. And they're extremely popular. It's called Grupo Sotzil that you can look up. To end with, I want to take one real quick look to a moment to look at the challenges that come to relocalization. Obviously, there are always going to be strong, powerful economic and political interests in maintaining the model of globalized food production, globalized energy production, globalized culture. There are embedded economic interests that want to maintain the status quo. At the same time, there's also a sense of comfort, ease, efficiency, and apparent abundance that is associated with our global world. People go to the supermarket and they see shelves of food. They turn on their internet and they see endless Netflix streaming opportunities. And there's this idea that globalization really offers us all sorts of things, right? However, we need to understand that the globalization of our lives comes at the expense of the loss of locality, the loss of belonging to place, the loss of autonomous food production, the loss of the resiliency that comes with creating strong local cultures and strong local economies. To maintain these economic interests and the sense of ease and comfort and efficiency that come with the globalized model, we're going to see more authoritarian governance models that continue to arise, right? In order to maintain this global economic model, there's going to have to be strong government that protects these interests, that maintains, this globalized model in the face of all of the ecological and economic and social crises that are developing. And lastly, by relocalizing our food, energy, economic, educational, and cultural systems, this may lead to short-term challenges. However, in the long term, I think a localized system, a localized culture, a localized food production, localized energy systems, localized economies are going to be much more resilient in the face of climate change, in the face of energy shortages, in the face of geopolitical tensions and wars. So if we take a long-term look about what's going to be best for our communities, trying to strengthen all of these aspects of localization is going to be in our best interest.